when they look at a solicitation and say requires compliance with CMMC level 1 or CMMC, more likely CMMC level 2, and they haven't yet done all the process to be able to succeed there. And I think that would be a competitive differentiator that primes will use when they assess who do they want to include in their supply chain.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. Word on the street is SpaceX is going to tell NASA it can't land American astronauts on the moon until September 2028. At the earliest, according to Politico. This follows acting NASA Administrator Sean Duffy's announcement that NASA is reopening the Artemis program contract for the first crewed moon landing in over 50 years. Duffy is also Transportation Secretary. He said on CNBC that SpaceX is falling so far behind, it could force the president to break his campaign promise, which is to land Americans on the moon before his term ends in January 2029. So the administration is, looking for options. Meanwhile, China says it will have taikonauts on the moon no later than 2030. So the stakes are high. The NASA contract in question is fixed price, worth $2.89 billion, and was awarded in 2021. There's a follow-on SpaceX contract for another landing mission. That's worth $1.15 billion, roughly $4 billion total. And let's not forget, SpaceX founder Elon Musk isn't on President Donald Trump's Christmas card list. Blue Origin, which also has a human landing system contract, it just notched a serious win on Thursday. On New Glen's second flight ever, Jeff Bezos' company returned and landed the first stage booster, a huge milestone towards reusable launch. So if this launch system becomes certified, there will be an effect on the cost of launch. On that, you can bet on. And here's something else you can bet on. The Department of Defense is serious about cybersecurity and the defense industrial base. This week is the beginning of Phase 1 of the department's Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program, or CMMC. I get it. It's not sexy like landing on the moon, but the effect on the defense industrial base, including space companies, is strategic. If companies do not comply, they will lose contracts. And it won't matter if they are a prime contractor or a subcontractor or a subcontractor. The writing has been on the wall, and there have been a multitude of announcements about CMMC's implementation that span at least the last 3 administrations. That means everyone agrees that the industrial base, including the space sector, needs to get on board with securing their enterprises if they want to have a chance of doing business with the DoD and get a slice of the Golden Dome project's $175 billion budget. To get a better understanding of CMMC and what it's supposed to do, we have the executive director of the National Defense Information Sharing and Analysis Center, retired Air Force Colonel Steve Shirley, who is also a former executive director of the Defense Department's Defense Cyber Crime Center. Here's our conversation. Hello, Steve. It's a real honor to have you here on the Downlink podcast. Welcome.
Well, hi, Laura. It's great to be here.
Steve, you're not exactly a space nerd, but a lot of your work in uniform, then as a government executive, and now out of government, you're laser focused on cybersecurity, but also physical security for the defense industrial base and the supply chain. That's still a pretty massively broad scope of interest, right? So could you help me narrow this down a bit more and introduce yourself to the Downlink audience? Like, what do you do and where do you do it?
Well, thanks, Laura. So for everybody out there, I'm Steve Shirley. I spent forever and a day as an Air Force guy. Graduated as a vice commander from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, kind of like the chief operating officer. OSI's essentially equivalent to the FBI in terms of its mission scope, but internal to the Air Force. And so through that career, as part of which is spent in Europe and Asia and other places, we help protect Air Force people and DoD assets from criminal threats, terrorism, and spies that were interested in the Department of the Air Force and are supporting contractors who provide systems capabilities and technologies to the Air Force. So, and then I had the opportunity to become the head coach of the DoD Cyber Crime Center for a few years, and so that's where I really got submerged in cybersecurity as a thing, and cybersecurity particularly as it affected the defense contractors who invent, build all those technologies and capabilities that Department of Defense relies on to execute for national security objectives. So, and where I am now, the National Defense Information Sharing and Analysis Center, that is a nonprofit, non-federal entity comprised of 170 companies. About 2/3 of the membership are traditional defense contractors that most companies can name, but about 1/3 of the membership have much larger lines of business in an adjacent sector. As I think you know, that the department buys that include financial services, energy products, and so forth. So about 1/3 of the membership are companies with a very large footprint in energy, pharma, the financial sector, and so forth. So that enables the participation that we have who share threats about cyber issues that are banging on their networks for us to get a really, really rich picture of what the cybersecurity nerds would call the attack surface of the defense industrial base. It's a great place to be, and the huge privilege of sitting and listening to really smart people talk about all the complexities of cybersecurity and protecting companies from nation state threat actors.
Now,
Thank
you know, I'm not going to let you totally get away with not mentioning space in your background because you have been eyeball deep in this stuff since you were an Air Force officer, as you just said. And I'm bringing up your military career here because at some point, well, before you retired from the Air Force, and folks, you can call him Colonel Shirley. But Steve, you did work with space systems at one point as well, no?
Well, thank you. Back when dinosaurs roamed the earth and there was such a thing as the United States Space Command, I was a counterintelligence support officer to the J2 at U.S. Space Command, and in another role was the squadron commander for Air Force Office of Special Investigation Units that were supporting all the bases that were associated with Air Force Space Command. Now, there was a nexus there in terms of being able to at least listen to really smart people in space talk about the sorts of things that they were concerned about to put stuff on orbit. So,
All right, now let's get into the reason why you're here on the podcast. And that is because this week, and in fact, this day, marks the beginning of phase one implementation of CMMC. And while I did say this in the introduction, let's remember that CMMC stands for Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. Dead boring title. That is hugely important to the entire defense industrial base. And that includes space systems and its supply chains. It's important, it's necessary, and it will be costly. So, what is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification? What does it require the defense industrial base to do?
well, thanks, Laura. It's a three-tiered model. It introduces to every company doing business with the Department of Defense, or every company who wants to do business with the Department of Defense, a series of technical controls that they're obligated to note and integrate in their network enterprises. The three tiers, tier one is the lowest level or the foundational level, and it requires a self-assessment by companies. And companies have to then report that self-assessment to the department in something called the supplier risk system. And then phase two becomes considerably more complicated because companies who perform in phase two, or who will perform on contracts, I should say, that involve controlled unclassified information will have to succeed at level two. And that will require them to integrate 110 technical controls, again, export or borrow from the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, and then be assessed that they comply with those. And that would also, I think, is on a 3-year cycle that they would have to redo that. Phase 3 is the toughest one, or tier 3, I should say.
On level 3.
Level 3, excuse me. Yeah, that's right.
Level, tier, could be floor,
Is first of all, those companies
balcony.
will have to succeed in level 2, and then level 3 will introduce additional controls for companies who are performing on selected products or technologies for the department. So it's a pretty complicated set of issues and a fairly significant scope. The department indicates that they will introduce it in a phased rollout over time because of just the breadth of and number of companies within the defense industrial base.
And just to, keep everybody here on the same train, going down the same track, it is a phased rollout. As you say, it's over 3 years, starting today, and it's supposed to be in full implementation by 2028, right? And what I found really interesting when I was looking into the background of this, it's just like the number of requirements for these different levels. Level 1 has 15 requirements and a self-assessment, as you said. Level 2 is 110 requirements, which I imagine would also include the 15 requirements. And then level 3 is 134 requirements. And level 3 is for like the big stuff, like the scary, advanced, persistent threats stuff. And I don't know how you come to agree to, what is, advanced persistent threats, because it seems to me that every day everyone's getting pinged with some sort of, thing that is threatening something on their system. But today, the day that we're recording, is the first day of phase 1, and as I said, phase 4 is full implementation. So to get through these different phases, the Department of Defense is obviously going to come at this with some carrots and sticks associated with compliance, no?
Well, the carrot, of course, the big one is, do you want to do business with the Department of Defense or not? And so that will be a mandatory requirement for companies, certainly at level 2, and most assuredly at level 3, because, that's the level that you have to demonstrate success to be able to receive contract information that's designated as controlled unclassified information, or CUI.
Basically sensitive stuff.
Well,
that isn't exactly a state secret, but still you don't really want it out there.
Yeah, unclassified but sensitive. It doesn't fall within the national or the classification levels, confidential, secret, or top secret. But it's what the department designates as not within the public domain, is one way to think about it. And maybe many of the listeners may recall the now defunct label of for official use only. CUI is broader than that, but if they think of FOU, they're in the right neighborhood. And so that's the level that will implicate a huge number of companies that want to do business with the department. The other thing that's key to know about CMMC is that as a contract is awarded to a prime and a prime contractor, and for many of the audience, they know that that's Lockheed, Raytheon, Grumman, BAE, Northrop, Boeing, and others, that CMMC provides for a flow down of the requirements from the prime through all the subs who are performing for the prime on that particular contract. So from 1 to N. And so the prime becomes responsible for ensuring that all of those subs are responsive to and compliant with CMMC.
So this is really far-reaching.
Really far, absolutely. And on down to, the small company who is doing castings and forgings for some subassembly of a larger piece that the prime is responsible for.
Everybody hold on to that data point, because we are going to revisit that a little bit later. But it's worth noting here that the DoD may implement some of these requirements early, or phases, I guess you could say, depending upon the sensitivity of the procurement or acquisition. So you got to let us know here, why have we gotten to this point that we actually need a requirement? I mean, what's the backstory?
Well, the backstory, you have to wind the clock back to about 2017. And 2017 was the rollout, the mandatory implementation of this acronym alert, Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement 202-204-7012. And 7012 was a mandatory clause effective 31 December 2017. And so that obligated contractors who had DFR 7012 in the contract to integrate those 110 technical controls that we mentioned a moment ago that were borrowed from the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. And this was a key point, and make a self-attestation that they had done so.
So it was up to them to look into themselves and say, right, everything's clean here, everything's great.
That's right.
But obviously that wasn't really good enough, was it? Because now when you're looking at tier 2 stuff, I mean, it has outside people that can go and look in your stuff and say, yes, this is actually what they say this is. The self-attestation or self-assessment is only good for tier 1, but tier 2 and tier 3, it gets a bit more serious.
Well, the self-attestation, DoD at the time believed that there were reasons why self-attestation was not as satisfactory as they hoped it would prove. And so that was really kind of the genesis for, okay, DoD says we're going to do something else. And that was a knock on the door assessment of every company within doing business with the Department of Defense. A pretty big lift.
Now, you've also seen the news that the Secretary of Defense wants to light a fire under acquisitions and expand the defense industrial base. A few days ago, Pete Hegseth revealed a new acquisitions reform policy to an audience at the National War College. This new policy has a strategy paper and memos on implementation. CMMC is about securing the acquisition supply chain from factory floor to warfighter. And, it's got to affect this, right? So I know that you haven't had a huge amount of time to dig into the documents. They were released just 4 hours before we started this recording. But in that time, I want to know what stuck out to you. This is, of course, just initially on skimming the documents. But yeah, what caught your eye?
Well, there's certainly intersections. I think the thing at first blush, and this was based on about 5-second speed read, something called the JROC, and you're gonna the Joint Requirements Operational Council has prevailed for about at least 30 years, I think, in terms of how the Department of Defense, starting with the military services, built requirements for weapon systems and capabilities, right? And over time, people have bemoaned that it was pretty clunky, although it had its features in terms of ensuring that multiple entities weren't building the same widget. But one of the things that one of its critique points was it took a long time. And if you realize that your pacing potential adversary had developed a superior widget, then it was a challenge to research, engineer, build, and field that faster than the adversary. And so it was, some dissatisfaction over time with that. And so what those documents or issuances from the Department of War do is really set aside the JROC process and really supplant that with something that's intended to dramatically shorten the time cycle from identifying a need or a new technology to fielding it and getting it deployed. So Steve's Forrest Gump summary there, but that's what jumps out.
Oh, life is a box of chocolates, right? So how will this new acquisition policy and CMMC work with, say, foreign military sales, right? I mean, the secretary has definitely emphasized greater burden sharing with allies, and allies are upping the amount of budget and acquisitions. And Germany, for instance, very specifically wants to spend a lot of money on acquiring sovereign space systems that will likely have U.S. suppliers. I know that this is something that the space sector is definitely involved in. So how does CMMC work with that?
Well, that's a great question. And so we're getting a prequel of that. And I'm seeing this in discussions among our NDISAC member companies and technical working groups. And we have a couple that are very tightly focused on CMMC. One's called Policy Standards and Regulations. And believe me, it's all about CMMC. The other is DoD assessments, and where Company X says, here's how I prepared, here's how I got assessed, here's what worked well, here's what I do differently if I could have an alibi. And so, what we're hearing in that is that our partners, like the UK, Australians, the Canadians, have developed their version of CMMC, and it's in an evolving process. And so, the question that the challenge that it has presented is that how do the companies recognize and satisfy, let's say, the Australian version of CMMC, and or does their compliance with, the Department of War CMMC, is there reciprocity there, or is there, trade space or places where it doesn't align?
Couldn't they just sort of figure out which one has got the most rigid rules or see where the gaps are in that one and then just kind of everybody works off of the same song sheet, so to
Yeah,
speak?
certainly one way to do it. And, but there are always issues of sovereignty. This, we apply this to our companies, and we expect if you're going to do business with us in our space that you'll observe our requirements. And so presently, a lot of the discussion has taken place, at least over the last year or so, by each of the companies who are engaged with that foreign partner. And so one of the asks from the companies, not surprisingly, is for DoD to strap this on and homogenize these requirements with Australia, Canada, UK, such that it doesn't kind of put the company in the position of doing a county option, so to speak, and taking on risk that perhaps in that process. So that's one area where there's an intersection, or will be an intersection.
Or is an intersection,
Right.
right? I mean,
Mhm.
this implementation starts today. So
Right.
the intersection is, well, today. So let's shift gears. We really do need to talk about space. What do you think are the CMMC implementation priorities for the space sector? Is space different in any way?
So for part of it, I think it is different. I think but for the terrestrial assets and the terrestrial infrastructure in terms of command and control and comms through the all of the facilities and installations that they have to build and manage assets, I think those things are CMMC is very aligns very well with securing their systems. I think the difference becomes in engineering, how companies think about our on orbit assets to contend with space threats. I don't think CMMC has necessarily contemplated those sorts of issues.
Now, give us an example.
Well, maybe electromagnetic pulse or radiation, for example, or shielding to survive. There's no requirement within CMMC that are responsive to that. At least not that I've heard any discussion about.
Okay, so so you think that the differences would really be in terms of the physical sort of aspects of on-orbit systems?
Well,
Because
that's
CMMC is, cybersecurity maturity model,
mhm.
right?
So in the comms, the point to point on the terrestrial assets, all the controls that are contemplated in CMC apply very well in that use case.
Easy peasy. It's here on the ground. Go in, stick
Right.
in, make sure you're not being taken over, that somebody's not trying to shut down your air conditioning and therefore, killing off your data center
Exactly.
inside of your
Yeah,
downlink
exactly.
center and uplink.
Now,
Yeah, okay.
there may be a discussion whether they apply or how much they apply to satellite or links. And I think altogether, perhaps a different use case, again, going back to shielding on orbit assets or other things that are wholly unique to asset sitting in space. It's just my sense that CMMC just doesn't wrap around that, or at least not intended to wrap around that.
Interesting. Let's get into your mind's eye here a bit. You know, Where could you see issues with the space sector and implementation? Right? Young companies, and we've got quite a few young companies in the space sector,
Mhm.
they may argue that they do not have the cash on hand to implement CMMC. But investors, knowing that contracts will depend on getting this certification, they may even require it before writing checks. What's an entrepreneur to do here? Is this a chicken and the egg problem for them?
Well, you kind of put your finger, I think, on one thing. The investors may well recognize it. That's a hard requirement for the company to move forward and do business with the Department of Defense. But I also kind of see an analog with companies that some of whom may be in the space sector if they're doing different engineering of assemblies that are going to be integrated in something that's going to go on orbit. And I kind of think of this as something of a Maslow's hierarchy of needs for small companies. And if you'll bear with me for a second, I'll explain that. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs was, a social science concept that, humans needed very basic things, most importantly, water, food, shelter, right?
Yeah,
So,
hey, if you want to understand this, I recommend to everybody to watch Naked and Afraid. It'll make it very, very clear about what the priorities are and what happens when they are not adhered to.
So how does that construct cross over to small companies? Well, so I've had the advantage to be able to listen to small companies or people who are running small companies talk for about 20 years, and several things jump out that are really important to them. First and foremost, they've got to build product and push it to their prime, right, or their customer. And they've got to deliver it on time and on spec, right? Number two, they've got to recruit, train, and retain a skilled workforce to be able to do number one, right? Then they've got to be able to compensate those skilled people that they've worked so hard to find and train and so forth. And then they've got to rinse and repeat that in a continuous cycle to be able to stay in business. And so if you're a small company who is doing castings and forging, you're all about being an expert in castings and forgings. You're maybe not all about being an expert in cybersecurity. So what I hear a number of people, leaders in those companies, look at that and say, "Holy Moses, I've got to do what? What again?" And in CMMC, and so I kind of worry that even though that the department has published a lot about CMMC, the people who are running small companies haven't had their heads buried in cybersecurity texts. They've had their heads buried in being superior in the business that they're in, whether it's castings and forgings or microelectronics or sub-assemblies for some space asset. And so they've either got to get very smart very quickly, or they've be in the position of hiring someone at additional cost who is smart, who will get them smart enough to comply and be eligible for DoD contracts pursuant to the CMMC requirements. And so I think there are a cohort of small companies who've had their head in the game, so to speak. And we have some of those companies, for example, in the National Defense ISAC, where they have made the decision to be part of a peer organization where they can learn about all the requirements that are going to devolve on them. And in some cases, some of these smaller companies have even hired a managed service provider to do a lot of these functions for them at additional cost, of course. And so I think they are exceptional and they're at the head of their class, so to speak, relative to CMMC requirements compared to, I fear, many small companies across the defense industrial base that are gonna get a kind of a sobriety checkpoint when they look at a solicitation and say, "Ooh, requires compliance with CMMC level one or CMMC, more likely CMMC level two," and they haven't yet done all the process to be able to succeed there. And I think that would be a competitive differentiator that primes will use when they assess who do they want to include in their supply chain.
So let's say, for instance, there is a company, space company, that's got a particular kind of technology that prime is going to need, say, for layered missile defense. And it's really only this one company that has developed this thing.
Uh-huh.
Who's going to eat the cost of CMMC implementation? Is it going to be the small company? Who owns the technology that nobody else has, or is it going to be the prime?
That's a fascinating question. And framed as you have put it there, small company has exclusive, has the intellectual property that no one else has, and the capability that the prime needs to succeed in whatever that contract is. I suppose you could fashion a scenario where the prime will say, I'm going to help you succeed and attain level, we'll call it level 2 again, in CMMC. Now, I will tell you, I have not heard any of my industry colleagues in any of these technical meetings that I sit on the edges of talk about that scenario, but I don't think it's necessarily far-fetched either.
I gotta say, I talk to a lot of really interesting companies, and sometimes they're going to have a unique technology that only they have at the time that I'm speaking with them, or a prime is looking for a very particular kind of fit for their system that they are trying to develop and sell. Because sometimes it is going to be about best fit as well. So there could be a couple ways that a small company could be the best contender.
Yeah.
And that if you do bean counting, it might be less expensive to just, pay for them to become compliant. But,
I think you're right.
you know what I mean?
There are very close scenarios that I'm aware of where a Prime X has had a particular company that's crucial to their program, who's had some episode or issues in cybersecurity, and the Prime has helped, air quotes there, fix those issues in a particular sub because it was so consequential to the overall contract. So.
And just because small businesses, whether they be involved in space systems or not, I mean, we all are aware of the dialogue that's going on in the United States, that there have been pressures in terms of getting raw materials that might be sourced from Canada, let's say, like nickeloids or permanent magnets or other things, or people might need to have higher salaries because the cost of living has been, going up. I mean, inflation's real and it hasn't stopped, right? So there are a lot of different pressures. So that's why I raise, the money aspect of this. But just to wrap this up, and this is the last question, and want to get right to it with a quick answer because we are actually running out of time. But what happens if a supplier to a prime is found to be CMMC non-compliant? Who gets dinged? How would they be taken to the CMMC woodshed? Who gets taken to the CMMC woodshed? Would it be the prime? Would it be the subcontractor? Is it everybody?
Well, the phrase that is recurrent through CMMC is that all the requirements flow down from the prime through the sub. Then likely, if your scenario posits that the sub became non-compliant after they were on the contract, or let me put it this way, were compliant and then became non-compliant, then that would be an issue for obviously the sub, but also for the prime as well, in terms of the requirement to understand the status of their sub. And so the reporting, as it's currently envisaged to work, goes from the sub up through the prime and so forth. So I think there'd probably be questions for everyone in the stack there.
Steve, thank you so much for making the time to come on the podcast. I know there are more rabbit holes we can go down on this subject, but we're going to have to save it for another day.
Well, thanks, Laura. There are about, I think 50,000 rabbit holes, and so I think that's the right call.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello, and get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.